with an eye towards servicing global demand rather than the narrow needs of their imperial masters. Not only did opportunities increase in a globalized world, so too did scale. More capital flowing to more places triggered transformations in agriculture. Larger farms could be more mechanized, achieving greater efficiencies and output with less and less labor. Such optimization granted them the economic heft to demand better pricing for inputs. Instead of getting a few dozen bags of fertilizer and the odd hoe and such from the local store, large farms would contract directly with petrochemical firms and manufacturers for their needs. The very rationale for small towns eroded. Globalization didn't simply empty the countryside, it also gutted the world's smaller communities, forcing everyone into the major cities. And as true as this was in Nebraska or New South Wales, it was wildly more true in places like the Brazilian Cerrado or Russia's Black Earth region or China's Rice Belt. Every change results in the same change. More food grown and more food distributed, but done so with less labor. The initial phases of the Industrial Revolution may have pulled people off the farms by providing industrial employment. And the development of synthetic agricultural inputs may have pushed them into the cities. But the global competition provided by the order hurled farmers off their lands. And even that assumes the rising local agricultural behemoth firms don't muscle smallholders out, or that the government doesn't forcibly consolidate small plots into larger, more efficient factory farms. The former is more common in places where centralized control is weak, such as Argentina, Brazil, and Ukraine, while the latter is the norm in countries with a reputation for national development plans, such as India, China, and South Africa. Territories that had lacked regional security or sufficient capital since the dawn of recorded history could suddenly tap global flows to become significant producers and even exporters for the first time. Foodstuffs both increased in quality and decreased in cost. That put pressure on legacy producers in the developed world, forcing them to either up their game with tech to increase yields or give up the ghost and instead focus on things they did better. Tastes diversified. For the most part, countries gave up attempting to grow foods they couldn't grow well, drastically increasing their output for the crops they could grow well. The Americans' prohibition of military conflict among their allies eliminated the heartburn of worrying where one might get their next meal. Global agricultural trade exploded, and the need for national and imperial autarky went out the window. Americans' transformation of the global security and economic architecture, or more accurately, the Americans' creation of the world's first truly global security and economic architecture, enabled the industrialization and urbanization experiences that had defined Europe for the previous quarter millennia to go global. The first wave of globalization impacted the early incarnations of the Order Alliance: Western Europe, the defeated Axis, the warred states of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, and the other Anglo-settler states, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Technically, many Western Hemispheric nations were also part of the first round of the Order, as they were Bretton Woods signatories. But most of them chose to embrace the security aspect of the system, no empires, without meaningfully participating in the economic aspects. As with the British and Germans before them, the peoples of all these nations experienced mass development, mass urbanization, mass reductions in mortality, mass extensions of lifespans, mass expansions in population, and mass reductions in birth rates in that order. In fact, nearly all the population gains in the developed world since 1965, overall at greater than 50% increase, are from longer lifespans. And just as the Germans had followed the British path and so experienced a faster, more compressed version of the entire demographic transition, so too did the first big batch of post-World War II states. The path had gotten easier to follow. Water, not electricity, powered the first factories. There were as many limitations on where they could be built as there were on the cities of ancient times, which similarly limited the need for workers to staff them. The rise of interchangeable parts and assembly lines predated electricity. Such early industrial efforts may have surpassed the output of previous manufacturing norms by an order of magnitude, but they still required either wind, water, or muscle to energize them. That limited the speed and scope and location of their adoption to very specific geographies of success, retarding the urbanization impact. But by 1945, the Germans had demonstrated that electricity was the only way to go. Suddenly a factory could be put anywhere. History sped up. The British may have blazed the path to development, but it was the Germans who paved it for the rest of us. Instead of the 7 generations it took to transform Britain, or the 4 for Germany, the Canadians, Japanese, Koreans, Italians, and Argentines did it in 2.5, while a group of advanced nation latecomers, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, did it in 2. Nor did the story end there. After the Cold War's end, the Americans threw open order membership to the former neutrals, as well as the former Soviet world. The result was the same assault of capital access, resource access, and technological access that generated the European and Japanese booms of the 1950s and 1960s, but across a much wider swath of the world and a much larger slice of humanity. Now, the vast bulk of the developing world could join in the industrializing, urbanizing, demographics-changing fun, with the largest new players being China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico, Philippines, Vietnam, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Turkey. Just as the addition of electricity to the industrial toolkit sped up the process, so did the digital revolution. With information no longer locked within individual brains, but instead flowing freely on a river of electrons, expertise could be shared with the click of a button. Prototyping sped up from a years-long process to mere weeks. What was known could be disseminated within seconds, while research collaboration could cross continents and oceans alike. Just as the Germans were able to walk down the path faster than the British, and just as the Japanese were able to jog down the path faster than the Germans, and just as the Spanish were able to run down the path faster than the Japanese, now the more advanced nations of the developing world, specifically the Chinese, Brazilians, and Vietnamese, could sprint down that same road faster than the Spanish. And yet, despite all the wildly unplanned changes, somehow it all not simply worked, but worked beautifully. What was truly spectacular, even magical, about the post-Cold War